All right, we're back. We're ready for our next chapter. Today, I'm reading from the pool. This is my parents' pool. Okay, I had Sky here swimming earlier because it was such a nice day. Her toys are back there. Okay, it's my parents' backyard, so she loves being here. I love being here. It's fun, and it was a good day to swim. So hopefully you guys are doing fun things during your summer. I'd love to hear in the comments section what you're doing, okay, because I miss you guys. Can't wait to see lots of you next year. Okay, of course you're going to have to come visit me, so when you get off the buses, you can stop by my door. Okay, we are ready to continue on in our story. Today we're on chapter 3. Now, before I start chapter 3, I'm going to show you the picture that's on chapter 3's cover, or on the first page of chapter 3, because I think it's going to be interesting, and I think it might give us information for later on in the story, but it might just kind of like leave us wondering right now, but I think it's going to be interesting. So this is what chapter 3 looks like. Okay, so we have two arms holding pots and pans, and the arms look, first of all, disgusting. Okay, this nasty scraggly hair. Okay, and then these two pots. Is this person cooking with pots? When I showed Sky this picture, she thought he was using them to like play his instruments, so I don't know. We will see. But why don't we dive in and figure it out, or read to see if we will figure it out or not. Okay, chapter 3. Morning is an important time of day because how you spend your morning can often tell you what kind of day you are going to have. For instance, if you wake up to the sound of twittering birds and find yourself in an enormous canopy bed with a butler standing next to you holding a breakfast of freshly made muffins and hand-squeezed orange juice on a silver tray, you will know that your day will be a very splendid one. If you wake up to the sound of church bells and find yourself in a fairly big, regular bed with the butler standing next to you holding a breakfast of hot tea and toast on a plate, you know that your day might just be okay. And if you wake up to the sound of somebody banging two metal pots together and find yourself in a small bunk bed with a nasty forearm standing in the doorway holding no breakfast at all, you will know that your day will be horrid. You and I, of course, cannot be too surprised that the Baudelaire orphans' first day at the Lucky Smells lumber mill was a horrid one. And the Baudelaires certainly did not expect twittering birds or a butler, nor after their dismaying arrival. But never in the most uneasy dreams did they expect the cacophony, a word which here means the sound of two metal pots being banged together by a nasty foreman standing in the doorway holding no breakfast at all, that awoke them. So now we know whose arms and pans they are. "Get up, you lazy, smelly things," cried the foreman in an odd-sounding voice. He spoke as if he were covering his mouth with his hands, so I guess it sounded like this. "Get up, you lazy, smelly things. Time for work, everybody. There's a new shipment of logs just waiting to be made into lumber." The children sat up and rubbed their eyes. All around them, the employees of the Lucky Smells lumber mill were stretching and covering their ears at the sound of the pots. Phil, who was already up and making his bunk neatly, gave the Baudelaires a tired smile. "Good morning, Baudelaires," Phil said. "And good morning, Foreman Flacutono. May I introduce you to our 3 newest employees? Foreman Flacutono, this is Violet, Klaus, and Sonny Baudelaire." "I heard we'd have some new workers," the foreman said, dropping the pots to the floor with a clatter, "but nobody told me they'd be midgets." "We're not midgets," Violet explained. "We're children." "Children, midgets, what do I care?" Foreman Flacutono said in his muffled voice, walking over to the orphan's bunk. "All I care is that you get out of bed this instant and go straight to the mill." The Baudelaires hopped out of the bunk bed, not wanting to anger a man who banged pots together instead of saying good morning. But once they got a good look at Foreman Flacutono, they wanted to hop back into their beds and pull the covers over their heads. "I'm sure you've heard it said that appearance does not matter so much, and that it is what's on the inside that counts. This is, of course, utter nonsense, because if it were true, then people who were good on the inside would never have to comb their hair or take a bath, and the whole world would smell even worse than it already does. Appearance does matter a great deal, because you can often tell a lot about people just by looking at how they present themselves." And it was the way Foreman Flacutono presented himself that made the orphans want to jump back into their bunks. He was wearing stained overalls, which never make a good impression. and his shoes were taped shut instead of being tied up with laces. But it was the foreman's head that was the most unpleasant of all. Foreman Flacutono was bald as an egg, but rather than admit to being bald like most sensible people do, he had purchased a curly white wig that made it look like he had a bunch of large, dead worms all over his head. Some of the worm hairs stuck straight up, some of them curled off to one side, and some of them ran down his ears and his forehead, and a few of them stretched out straight ahead as if they wanted to escape from Foreman Flacutono's scalp. Below his wig was a pair of dark and beady eyes, which blinked at the orphans in a most unpleasant way. As for the rest of his face, it was impossible to tell what he looked like because it was covered with a cloth mask, such as what doctors wear when they are in hospitals, or what we all know because of COVID. Foreman Flacutono's nose was all curled up under the mask, like an alligator, hiding in the mud. And when he spoke, the Baudelaires could see his mouth opening and closing behind the cloth. It is perfectly proper to wear these masks in hospitals and, of course, to stop the spreading of germs, but it makes no sense at all if you were the foreman at the Lucky Smells lumber mill. The only reason Foreman Flacutono could have for wearing a surgical mask would be to frighten people, and as he peered down at the Baudelaire orphans, they were quite frightened indeed. "The first thing you can do, Baudelaires," Foreman Flacutono said, "is pick up my pots and never make me drop them again." "But we didn't make you drop them," Klaus said. "Bram," Sonny said, which probably meant something like, "and our last name is Baudelaire." "If you don't pick up those pots this instant," Foreman Flacutono said, "you will get no chewing gum for lunch." The Baudelaire orphans did not care much for chewing gum, particularly peppermint chewing gum, which they were allergic to, but they ran to get the pots. Violet picked one up and Sonny picked up the other while Klaus hurriedly made the beds. "Give them to me," Foreman Flacutono snapped, and he grabbed the pots out of the girls' hands. "Now, workers, we've wasted enough time already. To the mills. Logs are waiting for us." "Oh, I hate log days," one of the employees grumbled, but everyone followed Foreman Flacutono out of the dormitory and across the dirt-floored courtyard to the lumber mill, which was a dull gray building with many smokestacks sticking out of the top like a porcupine's quills. The three children looked at one another worriedly, except for one summer day, back when their parents were still alive, when the Baudelaires had opened a lemonade stand in front of their house. The orphans had never had jobs, so they were kind of nervous. The Baudelaires followed Foreman Flacutono into the lumber mill and saw that it was all one huge room, filled with enormous machines. Violet looked at a shiny steel machine with a pair of steel pinchers like the arms of a crab and tried to figure out how this invention worked. Klaus examined a machine that looked like a big cage with an enormous ball of string trapped inside, and he tried to remember what he had read about lumber mills. Sonny stared at a rusty, creaky-looking machine that had a circular saw blade that looked quite jagged and fearsome, and she wondered if it was sharper than her own teeth. And all three Baudelaires glanced at a machine covered in tiny smokestacks that held a huge, flat stone up in the air and wondered what in the world was that doing here. The Baudelaires only had a few seconds to be curious about these machines, however, before Foreman Flacutono began clanging his two pots together again and barking out orders. "The logs!" he shouted. "Turn on the pincher machine and get started with the logs." Phil ran to the pincher machine and pressed an orange button on it. With a rough whistling noise, the pinchers opened and stretched toward the far wall of the lumber mill. The orphans had been so curious about the machines that they hadn't noticed the huge pile of trees that were stacked, leaves, roots, and all, along one wall of the lumber mill, as if a giant had simply torn a small forest out of the ground and dropped it into the room. The pinchers picked up the tree on top of the stack and began lowering it into the ground, while Foreman Flacutono banged his pots together and shouted, "The debarkers! The debarkers!" Another employee walked to the back corner of the room, where there were a stack of tiny green boxes and a pile of flat metal rectangles, as long as and as thin as an adult eel. Without a word, she picked up the pile of rectangles and began distributing them to the workers. Distributing is like passing them out. "Take a debarker," she whispered to the children, "one each." The children each took a rectangle and stood there, confused and hungry, just as the tree touched the ground. Foreman Flacutono clanged his pots together again, and the employees crowded around the tree and began scraping it with their debarkers, filing the bark off each tree as you or I might file our nails. "You too, midgets," the foreman shouted, and the children found room among the adults to scrape away at the tree. Phil had described the rigors of working in a lumber mill, and it had certainly sounded difficult. But, as you remember, Phil was an optimist, so the actual work turned out to be much, much worse. For one thing, the debarkers were adult-sized, and it was difficult for the children to use them. Sunny could barely lift her debarker at all, so she used her teeth instead. But Violet and Klaus had teeth of only an average age sharpness, and so had to struggle with the debarkers. Sky just joined our read aloud. The 3 children scraped and scraped, but only tiny pieces of bark fell from the tree. For another thing, the children had not eaten any breakfast, and as the morning wore on, they were so hungry that it was difficult to even lift the debarker, let alone scrape it along the tree. And, for one more thing, once a tree was finally cleared of its bark, the pinchers would drop another one onto the ground, and they would have to start all over again, which was extremely boring. But, for the worst of it all, the noise at the Lucky Smells lumber mill was simply deafening. The debarkers made their displeasing scraping sound as they dragged across the trees. The pinchers made their rough whistling noises as they picked up logs. And Foreman Flacutono made his horrendous clanging noises as he banged his pots together. The orphans grew exhausted and frustrated. Their stomachs hurt and their ears rang. And they were unbelievably bored. Finally, as the employees finished the 14th log, Foreman Flacutono banged his pots together and shouted, "Lunch break!" The workers stopped scraping and the pinchers stopped whistling, and everyone sat down, exhausted, on the ground. Foreman Flacutono threw his pots on the floor, walked over to the tiny green boxes, and grabbed one. Opening it with a rip, he began to toss small pink squares at the workers, 1 to each. "You have 5 minutes for lunch," he shouted, throwing 3 pink squares at the children. The Baudelaires could see that a damp patch had appeared on his surgical mask, from the spit flying out of his mouth as he gave orders. "Just 5 minutes." Come here.
Mama?
She'll join us here. Say hi to everyone while we finish up the next chapter.
What are you
We're
reading?
reading a story that we started reading in school. Hang on.
Could you show me what?
Violet looked from the damp patch on the mask to the pink square in her hand, and for a second she didn't believe what she was looking at. "It's gum," she said. "This is gum." Klaus looked from his sister's square to his own. "Gum isn't lunch. Gum isn't even a snack." "Tanko!" Sunny shrieked, which meant something along the lines of, "And babies can't even have gum. They could choke on it." "You better eat your gum," Phil said, moving over to sit next to the children. "It's not very filling, but it's the only thing they will let you eat until dinner time." "Well, maybe we can get up a little earlier tomorrow," Violet said, "and make some sandwiches." "Oh, no, we don't have any sandwich-making ingredients," Phil said. "We just have one meal, usually a casserole, every evening." "Well, maybe we can go into town and buy some ingredients," Klaus said. "Well, I wish we could," Phil said, "but we don't have any money." "Well, what about your wages?" Violet asked. "Surely you can spend some of the money you earn on sandwich ingredients." Phil gave the children a sad smile and reached into his pocket. "At the Lucky Smells lumber mill," he said, bringing out a bunch of tiny scraps of paper, "they don't pay us in money. They pay us in coupons. See, here's what we all earned yesterday. 20% off a shampoo at Sam's Haircutting Palace. The day before that, we earned this coupon for a free refill on iced tea. And last week, we earned this one. Buy 2 banjos, get 1 free. The trouble is, we can't buy 2 banjos because we don't have anything but these coupons." "Nell knew," Sunny shrieked, but Foreman Flacutono began banging his pots together again before anyone could realize what she meant. "Lunch is over," he shouted. "Back to work. Everyone, back to work. Everyone except you, you bottle lamps. The boss wants to see you 3 in his office, right away." The 3 siblings put down their debarkers and looked at one another. They had been working so hard that they had almost forgotten about meeting their guardian, whatever his name was. What sort of man would force small children to work in a lumber mill? What sort of man would hire a monster like Foreman Flacutono? What sort of man would pay his employees in coupons or feed them only gum? Foreman Flacutono banged his pots together again and pointed at the door, and the children stepped out of the noisy room into the quiet of the courtyard.
Be careful, Bob.
Klaus took the map out of his pocket and pointed the way to the office. With each step, the orphans raised small clouds of dirt that matched the clouds of dread hanging over them. Their bodies ached from the morning's work, and they had an uneasy feeling in their empty stomachs. As they had guessed from the way their day began, the 3 children were having a bad day. But as they got closer and closer to the office, they wondered if their day was about to get even worse. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so we finished chapter 3. We still have no idea what the eye-shaped door is on the building across or outside the gate. Okay. we've finally met Foreman Flacutono, and we know he's absolutely horrible. Okay, we're still hanging out with Phil, who seems to be a good friend along the way. Hang on. And maybe in chapter 4, we're going to meet the owner. So I don't know. We will have to see. But I hope you enjoyed today's chapter, and tomorrow we will have chapter 4.